Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Art at Noon talk with exhibiting artist Maremi Andreozzi. I'm Kristen Butler, Director of Programs here at the Delaplane Arts Center. Before I hand things over to Exhibitions Manager Corey Fry, I wanted to mention that we would love for you to share your questions and comments. And now, Corey Fry.
Hi, everybody. Really good to be with you all. I want to mention really quick our hours here at the Delaplane. We are open for business. We've got some great exhibitions going on right now. So if you feel comfortable coming on out, I would encourage you to see the work in person. We've also got virtual exhibitions going on as well. Our hours are Monday through Saturday, 9 to 5, and Sunday from 11 to 5. So if you can make it out, that would be great. But I wanted to go ahead and introduce our speaker today. Really excited about Maremi being here. Our speaker today is Maremi Andreozzi, whose exhibition Lady Lineage is on display here at the Delaplane through January 31st. The exhibition reintroduces female artists, queens, pirates, witches, warriors, and more through a contemporary lens and allows a renewed study of their narratives. By examining the power of recording, archiving, and remembering, a new, more inclusive conversation emerges. Maremi grew up in Alexandria, Virginia, earned a BFA from Cornell University and an MFA from Clemson University, and now lives and works near Mount Vernon, Virginia. In August of 2019, she was an artist in residence at an international artist residency, La Messina di San Cresci, in Grève in Chianti, Italy. Her 2019 show, Hidden Histories at Signature at Greater Reston Art Center, received favorable reviews from the Washington Post and Burnaway. More recently, her work was exhibited at 14C Art Fair in New Jersey with Ada Rose Gallery and By the People X Chromosome Collective Virtual Art Fair, and was a part of a 3-person show at the Howard County Center for Arts in September. Join me in welcoming Maremi Andreozzi. Thanks so much, Maremi, for being here.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Thank you to the Delaplane Arts Center for this great opportunity to introduce my work to new viewers. Thank you to Corey Fray and for helping set up the exhibition. And thank you to Kristen Butler for helping coordinate this Artist at Noon talk. Lady Lineage is a selection of 2 bodies of work. I thought I'd start off by walking you through the show. These 2 pieces are on your immediate left when you first walk in the gallery. They are acrylic on canvas, 18 by 24. They're from the History Adorned series. I call them my History Adorned team version. Both completed this fall. The blue one is the Edmondson sisters, and the tan one is the suffragist, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Motts, and Susan B. Anthony. These team portraits reflect a new way of thinking about history as a collaborative process and ladies working together to create change. On the far wall is a selection of 15 history-adorned portraits, a myriad collection of work from the past 2 years, 12-inch by 12-inch acrylic on panel. I'll identify the portraits from left to right, starting at the top corner. We have Belva Lockwood, in the middle, Dr. Mary Edwards Walker, Anne Cunningham. The next row, Nur Jahan, Empress Dowager Chowquing, Mandaha Khatun, Margaret Brent, Elizabeth I, Weetamoo, Caroline Herschel, and Lady Wang Jinyi. And the last row, Catherine de' Medici, Rebecca Rolfe, Izumino Okunu, and Patience Wright. On the next wall are 4 pieces from my Painted Lady series. These are acrylic on paper, 20 by 24 inches. From left to right, Allegory of Portia, Portrait of a Lady in Green, Lamentation of Katerina, and Portrait of Elizabeth of Valois by Sophonisba and Guslova. The final wall has my largest piece in the show, an oil on canvas, 40 by 40 inches, The Martyrdom of St. Artemisia Gentileschi. The online version of this show also goes into more detail about each piece and allows you to navigate around the work. So I thought I'd start off talking about the Edmondson sisters. I'm particularly fond of this piece. Mary and Emily Edmondson were born in the 1830s in Montgomery County, Maryland. Their father was a free African-American man and their mother was an enslaved woman. The law at the time said children acquired their legal condition, bonded or free, from their mother. As teens, they were hired out to a prominent DC family. The Edmondson sisters were among 77 slaves who tried a nighttime escape to freedom down the Potomac River and up the Chesapeake to New Jersey. Unfortunately, the Pearl, the ship, experienced crippling headwinds, and the slave owners' henchmen soon caught up with them and brought them back to port. The Pearl incident was the largest attempted slave escape in history. There were days of riots in DC and Alexandria. The white captain and crew spent 4 years in jail. The girls were sold and sent down to New Orleans, where a yellow fever epidemic hastened their quick return back to Alexandria. In Alexandria, they were housed at the Bruin and Hill slave traders and were hired out as day laborers. Eventually, their father, with the help of the pastor, Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, brother to Harriet Beecher Stowe, and his congregation were able to raise the $2,250 needed to acquire their freedom. The sisters became prominent abolitionist speakers and toured throughout the Northeast, sharing their story. They went on to Oberlin College. Unfortunately, Mary died of tuberculosis within the first 6 months, and Emily continued her education at the University of the District of Columbia. She became a teacher and moved to Sandy Spring, Maryland, and Anacostia, DC later. She remained friends with Frederick Douglass throughout her life. So this piece was inspired by this sculpture by Eric Blome, dedicated in 2010. It's a sculpture by my father's office on Duke Street. His building was part of the Bruin and Hill property, a 2-acre parcel that included a slave jail and office, a slave pen, and the Bruin family home, as well as outbuildings. Now it sits across from a Whole Foods and towering apartment and office buildings off Duke Street in Alexandria. For me, it represents the embodiment of walking in the footsteps of history. I have countless times wondered what these two saw, thought, and experienced on this piece of land. The sculpture also has a powerful human feel. It's not at ground level, not on a pedestal. You can touch the faces of this sculpture. I like the thought that this work sits among our real life comings and goings. It is a constant reminder of human injustices and puts faces to willpower and strength. Also, I'm drawn to the sisters' stories, dramatic, but not defiant. Their acts of defiance are in their sharing their story, educating themselves, and living a life of freedom. These two also illustrate women I love to highlight in my work. They are local heroines, not as well known as they should be, and their story adds a human face and a local connection to a national dialogue on civil rights history and how we honor these figures. Here we have a daguerreotype from the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law Convention in Casanova, New York. The two girls are standing with plaid shawls and bonnets. Frederick Douglass is seated. Garrett Smith is behind him. He's the man who funded the Pearl escape attempt. My process is to pull images, photos, paintings, drawings from museum collections and Pinterest, and I create folders of visual resources to work from. So for the Edmondsons, I pulled photos of bonnets, shawls, ribbons to get a better handling on the fashion particulars of that time. So in this case, Civil War bonnets with linings, without linings, with and without ribbons, flowers, tied, untied, you get the point. And I create composites based on a number of these sources. I was also attracted to how the girls are depicted wearing matching outfits, which was a convention of the time and very much still is one. I find it so peculiar and eerie. To the right, you'll see some images I pulled from my study of American Civil War plaid. Plaid was fashionable in Europe, of course. There they had more refined plaid patterns and of course, nicer fabrics. The American version of this fashion trend was epitomized by Mary Todd Lincoln, more conservative and austere design, a more economical wool blend, and called buffalo plaid. Belva Lockwood. I was introduced to Belva from my husband's childhood friend, Christy, who is related to Belva and had mentioned she was the second woman who ran for president. I love hearing family genealogy. So this fall with the election, I finally dove into her history, and I was flabbergasted at all of her accomplishments and how little name recognition she has. In this case, I learned more about her from my favorite podcast, The History Chicks. What I love about this history podcast is how conversational and entertaining they make biographies. They do tend to put things in context so you get a big picture idea of what's going on at the time. I hope my work also taps into that entertainment factor, where it's approachable on different levels. You can enjoy it for the visual properties, color, line, details of lace, particulars of jewelry, and then hopefully connect with the history. In brief, Belva was a teacher, a principal of a school. She became a lawyer at 43 with a degree from George Washington University. She became the first woman admitted to the Supreme Court bar after she lobbied Congress for several years to permit women. She typically represented working class clients, and in her most famous case, she represented the Cherokee Nation against the US and won money owed. Belva was competent and determined. She caused uproar when at 51, she regularly rode an adult tricycle to the courts and to federal buildings and advocated for exercise. And she ran for president not once, but twice, even though she and women couldn't vote. Her accomplishments don't stop there. If you get a chance, look her bio up. For me, Belva represents someone who history has overlooked. She represents someone who hasn't been taken seriously. Where is her placard and life-size sculpture? I can't wait for her story to become a Netflix original movie. What also drew me to Belva was her connection to my friend. She isn't just a person in a history book. She's a great aunt or a great grandmother, someone a generation or so away from real people today, people I know. I mentioned that I love family history, and my family history is no exception. So I love that one of the women in this show is my 13th great grandmother too. For me, it just illustrates that we are all standing on the shoulders of our elders. Anne Pamela Cunningham. I learned about Anne Cunningham from a lecture featuring Anne Bay Godden, who is writing a biography of her, a book that is long overdue. Anne Cunningham was an unlikely heroine for history. She was thrown from a horse when she was a teenager and suffered lifelong pain from that experience. She was a product of upper-class Southern 19th century life, educated without a career option and expected to marry and play house. She became depressed with her social limitations. Prescribed laudanum and opioids, she was often bedridden from the side effects. She was subject to electromagnetic remedies. However, despite all this, at 37, on the heels of the Civil War, she started the Mount Vernon Ladies Association and saved Mount Vernon from derelict management and neglect. She raised $18,000, what would be $200,000 today, to purchase the property from a descendant of George Washington. During the war, she appointed regents to protect the property and created what we now know as the fundraising outreach. She created the blueprint for what we call American historical preservation. Anne falls into that category of women in history who have identified a problem, put aside their insecurities and discomforts, put their nose to the grindstone and work their butts off, and not receive due appreciation. I hope my work will be a part of that change. In my portrait of Anne, she was wearing a lace collar and matching cameo brooch and earrings of George Washington. She was a lifelong fan. In the background is a sketch of Mount Vernon. For me, so much of the joy of my work is gathering these women's strengths and stories, especially during this pandemic. It feels like they're feeding my mind and my soul, keeping me sane and grounded. I also find their hardships and life stories gives perspective to everything we're dealing with right now, politically and otherwise. But there's another way to talk about these women and these portraits, besides biographical. You can also think about them in relationship to power and self-determination. While I've talked mostly about women from the 19th century so far, this series started with figures from the 16th and 17th century. When I was working on the Painted Ladies series, more on that later, I kept coming across figures I wanted to research more. In terms of having authority, Catherine de' Medici is always viewed as a powerful French consort, regent, and power player. In fact, the stories of her political and religious manipulations and her treatment of her children, Margaret of Valois is example number 1, haven't reflected well on how history has remembered her. Similarly, Nur Jahan from the Mughal Empire in the 16th and 17th century was erased from history after her husband, the Emperor Jahangir, died. Nur Jahan was a woman who came to her husband's household widowed and with a young daughter, who rose to become one of the most powerful women in the Mughal Empire, nicknamed the Tiger Slayer because of her marksmanship. She had coinage with her name and a profile on it. She attended government proceedings behind a screen, and despite Muslim bans on being seen in public, she was very much out in the public. Behind her indisposed husband, she was running one of the most powerful empires. She also staged a rescue mission when her husband was abducted by a group staging an insurrection. When Jahangir died, she was confined to maintain her silence and power and removed from history. And if we think about power as being remembered, I have to mention Empress Dowager Chongqing from the 18th century China. It is her son's devotion to his mother and the portrait he commissioned on her 80th birthday that stands as a mark of her existence and place in history. Not a great deal is known about her otherwise. She was illiterate, and there are no personal journals or signatures on documents. Her accomplishment was moving from a low-ranking consort up the line and making sure her son was the successor. Or does owning land reflect strength, or appearing before a court as your own agent? In that case, Margaret Brent, who is considered one of the founding mothers of Maryland, should be viewed through this lens. Unmarried and independent, not only was she one of the largest landowners in colonial Maryland and later Virginia, she also acted as an attorney or legal representative when the governor of Maryland, Leonard Calvert, passed and assigned her his executor, which would have been awe-inspiring alone, but this was a time in Maryland history when the colony was in the throes of the English Civil War, and there were Virginia militiamen who had been recruited to defend Maryland, had not been paid, and would not leave without such. In fact, during the General Assembly, she asked for a vote, 2 votes actually, and she was denied. So I'm often asked why their faces are black. For starters, some of these women have no portraits. We know about Wiedemuth's description from Anne Rawlinson's book about her 3-month captivity during colonial and Native American unrest. Margaret Brent, Izumino Kunu, Mandua Khatun, also no portraits exist from their time period. So in some cases, I have had to rely on descriptions from books, images of rulers that came before or after them, or portraits of relatives. In short, I've had to use my imagination and creative license to fill in the unknown. Also, in creating a uniformity in their faces, they become universal. They are the every woman. They are stripped of their identifying characteristics, age and race at least. They are timeless, suspended in a mutual time. You, the viewer, gets to fill in the features. Do they look like you or someone you know? So what are you left with? Their adornments, jewelry, and fashion. But fashion is more than a social or economic statement. It reflects how women want to be memorialized and remembered, putting their best on, an ideal self, and not so unlike what we do today. Collectively, this series becomes a powerful display of women who have made a mark in history, some in big ways and some in smaller ways. Some as groundbreaking queens, regents, or leaders, like Elizabeth I, Wiedemuth, Nur Jahan, Mandua Khatun. Some as groundbreaking figures in their field of study, like Caroline Herschel, Lady Wang Jinyi, Izumino Kunu, Dr. Mary Edwards, and Belva Lockwood. Some as agents of peace, like Rebecca Roth. I've nearly completed 50 women's portraits now, and I'm amazed at the sheer number of women in history from all around the world that I am just now learning about. Here are 15 all together in conversation, ready for a first introduction or a second look. Portrait of a Lady in Green, Lady Gonzaga. This is part of a series called the Painted Ladies series. In this series, I'm creating symbolic portraits of women artists using their artistic language, subjects in their works, and visual techniques as sources. I start by pairing the artist with a vessel that is contemporary to their time period. I select vessels they would have been familiar with. The vessels become the figurative stand-in for the artist. So this work is a portrait of Lavinia Fontana, who was an Italian Mannerist painter. Born in 1552 in Bologna and trained by her father, she earned a living painting portraits of wealthy patrons from Bologna and Rome. Women especially wanted their portraits painted by her. It's also noteworthy that her husband acted as her agent and took care of their children. Here we see two paintings by Lavinia Fontana. In these two works, you can see how I've borrowed from her sense of perspective. She would often create a deep interior space with door frames opening up to other rooms and a window off in the distance. As a visual device, this is a very effective tool in focusing your attention on the main show, the subject. It's theatrical and dramatic, but it also creates a sense of mystery. We think, what's going on in that back room? Or right outside that window? Is this saying something about her sitters or about her? In this work, I've drawn inspiration from Maiolica. These sorts of apothecary jars were abundant and prevalent in a variety of shops. The National Gallery of Art in DC has a lovely collection of these. In this case, I used Google Arts and Culture site to visit this ceramic museum in Florence. I'm often asked why I use the vessel as a human symbol. The work that came before this was more pattern and decorative based. In that series, I was thinking about pattern, and that segued to patterns in history, particularly lace and textile pattern and craft. And I was interested in how patterns, design, and craftsmanship tell stories. Stories about the makers, stories about the transfer of craft knowledge, all variety of stories, and how I could add layers of meaning. The vessel is also an obvious classic feminine symbol. As a container, it references motherhood and fertility, and historically it has been a symbol used by religions. There's an abundance of literature on these arguments, but what I'm drawn to is the vessel as a historical and significant symbol. Like the silhouettes in the History Adorned series, it allows me to reference the human form without being tethered to necessary or correct features. For this work, I've drawn inspiration from this painting. What drew me to this portrait was, of course, the fantastic display of Italian couture, the green fabric, those necklaces, and that zimbalino, but also all the mysteries surrounding the work. Was this Laura Gonzaga? Scholars now believe it would have been impossible for this to be the sitter. It is now believed she entered a convent prior to this work being painted. But I also find it so curious that there is so little information about this painting. When I was first introduced to this portrait 2 years ago, it was in a small museum in Europe. During the huge comprehensive exhibition last year on Lavinia Fontana and Sofonista Anguissola at the Prado in Spain, this painting was absent. When I was looking up this work for today's talk, I see it's now in a private collection in the US, which is saddening to see something removed from public enjoyment. Again, I'm drawn to the gaps in the story and how I want to know more in an age when we think we can find anything out on the internet. And there are so many lost Fontanas out there. Finally, when you consider the time and money that went into having a portrait commission, it is so frustrating to have titles like Unidentified Sitter and Portrait of a Woman, names and people, all these lost stories. Lamentation of Katerina. This portrait is about Katerina van Humissen, who is recognized as the first Northern Renaissance woman artist. She was born in 1528 in Antwerp. Only a handful of portraits and religious works are attributed to her. She was also taught by her father, a successful Antwerp painter. In the 1540s, Maria of Austria, regent to the Low Countries of Spain, became a patron of her work. It's believed she stopped painting when she got married. This vessel comes from the Metropolitan Museum of Art collection. It's a salt glazed ewer that was similar to ones depicted in a number of her father's works. He painted genre works with moral and religious themes set in taverns and brothels usually. These ewers and tankards were created in Northern Europe around this time. I was introduced to Katerina from this work from the Baltimore Museum of Art. As you can see, its authorship is also questionable. I also have my doubts after working on this piece. Again, another mystery in need of scholarship. This work is more typical of Katerina's work. Her subjects are often lanky and awkward and have a completely different psychological mood. In this case, I'm drawing inspiration from Portrait of a Woman, National Gallery, London, and one of her religious works, The Lamentation of Christ from Antwerp. This concludes my talk. I want to thank you so much for your attention and your interest, and I hope this talk is giving you an insight into my process and my motivations. And of course, there's more information available online or in person, and I'll turn it over to the pros now. Thank you so much.
Maremi, that was really fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you.
I absolutely loved it. I'm finding it hard to like come up with questions for you because you were so thorough with everything. But I'm wondering if we can even just start off by talking about who has your interest right now, who's in your scope to be working on, and do you collect names of people, like lists of names that you want to do portraitures of, or?
I do a little bit. I have sort of little Post-it notes that I have a little collection of. So I sometimes will get people's names that way. I mean, people will sometimes tell me, oh, I'm related to da 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 da. And I'd be like, oh, that's interesting. And it will usually take me a while to sort of get that flame going. Yeah, and then also my daughter, who's 11, now it's become sort of like a family discussion. She'll, come home from school with a book and be like, you should do Patience Wright. She's a sculptor from the American Revolution. And so there are a couple pieces that I credit to her suggestion too. She's a big fan, so that's fun.
Could you talk a little bit about how you achieve the detail in your works?
I have really big glasses that I wear when I paint, and I have very tiny brushes. And my family makes fun of me. My studio is in my house, I should say that. It's on the top floor. And it's just a process of, getting in there and working it out. I mean, the portraits have a way of working 2D and 3D at the same time. So I like that push and pull too, and how you can, like some of my earlier works actually look more graphic, and they've now become a little bit more detailed. And also I've considered the background a little bit more with more recent pieces that I've done too. So it does seem to be an evolution. I mean, my first pieces that I mentioned were 16th and 17th century women. The National Women's Museum has this, challenge, can you name 5 women? And I kept thinking, can I name 5 women from the 16th century? I don't know. And so it sort of motivated me to do a little bit more research. And then I was also working on the female artist at the same time. So I kept coming across people's names, Maria de Medici and Isabella Clara Eugenia, and all these people that I just felt like, I just need to figure out who these people are. They're so interesting. But I kind of, for the longest time, was thinking I'm not going to do work from the 19th century because of photography, and how I felt that photography was, everything had already been said with photography. And it's interesting, my work is now gravitated more towards 19th century work. And I find it's actually not as revealing as I thought, but it does allow me more resources to work from, because there's, more things exist, more things are around, dresses and patterns and jewelry and newspapers and illustrations. I mean, there's just a plethora of material you can find to support what you're working on.
That's super interesting on the level of like, when I look at your work, I don't feel like you're not removing information from me. You're sort of withholding some information. And that seems really interesting on the level of like moving into the 19th century with photography. And one of my favorite quotes is Victor Hugo said, there's nothing more interesting than a wall behind which something is happening.
Oh.
And so like I love the idea of an impediment being introduced to my own understanding as a way to create wonder.
Uh-huh.
And I really feel that when I look at your work, there's this, information's being withheld from me, and so it wants me to draw nearer, and I really like that about your work. But
Oh, cool. That's a great way to look at it. Yeah.
we have a question in the chat from Heather Wandel, who says, enjoyed your exhibit very much. Visited just after Christmas. Could you talk a little bit more about Pocahontas?
Oh, okay. Rebecca Rolfe, yes, she's interesting. Let's see. I mean, she married John Rolfe, as you know, and she died very young. She was in her 20s. They'd gone to England as sort of like a tour, you know, his Indian Queen bride. And she was very instrumental in helping the colonists with, helping John Rolfe introduce a very productive form of tobacco, which, you know, I don't know how great that is, but and anyway, so very helpful in terms of navigating as sort of the middleman between the Powhatans and the colonists, the early colonists. What I find interesting when I was working on her portrait is that, you know, you usually see, she's one of these people that's been sort of turned into a Disney princess. And so there's so much myth out there about her. You know, she's often associated with Captain John Smith. And so I find that there's still not really a unifying truth that we can all come to about her. And also, when she married John Rolfe, she became a Christian. She changed her name from Pocahontas to Rebecca Rolfe. I find it also interesting. There are a number of women I've done who were born with one name, and then they married, they got a different name. And maybe, you know, they got a different name even further when like they became the regent of something. So it's interesting how women's identities change, their names change in relationship to men. I think that's kind of sort of interesting. And also her portrait that I based that on was supposedly done in London, but it's a very, very stylized portrait. I'm not really sure that it really has very many identifying characteristics about her. The original, I'm talking about the original in the London Museum. So she's another person where there's a lot of mystery around her, and I am just attracted to mysteries.
Another question from Amy Jaycox says, do you find that by reducing women to their clothes and jewelry, it's an easier way to help the average viewer connect to the women in their space and time?
Do I think it's easier? I suppose. I mean, I think there's sort of a level that we all like the shiny, we're all attracted to the shiny thing maybe. And so if you walk in and you don't know that you're looking at history portraits, I think you can think about objects. I mean, one of the things that sort of crossed my mind is how objects have a history. You know, with the pearl earrings and a lot of the French jewelry from the 16th and 17th century. I mean, it would usually be repurposed when the next emperor came into power and turned into the next blingy thing. So I think it is a way for people to connect. I think people are always interested. What did people look like in the past? You know, it's sort of this question we have.
One question that comes to mind technically is, as you started this series, was there an iterative process as far as like, it seems that almost a compositional challenge in some ways to deal with very technical, precise details and large spots of just one empty color, and the relationship between those two things. So I wondered if were there failed attempts that you had to work through in order to figure out the best way to represent it?
Oh yes, and I still am struggling with that. I mean, partially because it's work on panel, so it's not very forgiving for mistakes. So with these pieces, you have to build them up in layers and make sure before you put that sort of the final coats on that everything is where you want it to be. Because if not, you get these ridges, and I guess I'm a stickler for particulars like that. But so there's that, and then there's also like a certain sheen that the surface has, and I don't glaze my works, but so I kind of like, I build up the surface to a certain point where it has a consistent finish, or luster over the whole thing, and that takes some time. So there are plenty of pieces that I've had to sand down and then rebuild back up again. Yeah, and it takes a lot of concentration too. That's also sometimes I'll have music on or something, and sometimes I just have to paint in silence because I'm trying to figure out, like, especially with the lace collars, because I don't do preparatory drawings for that. I have to figure out the pattern in my head and then work from big to small. And then depending on if the loops are triangles or if the the applique pieces are connected in different ways, you kind of have to like get into how it was made so that you can figure out how to paint it, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
that's amazing. We had another question come in from Greg, and it's, what kind of music do you listen to when you're working? Do you listen to music of, he's not asking this, but I'm going to add to his question. Do you listen to music that's of the period of the portrait, the person who you're painting?
That would be a fantastic idea. I wish I did. No, usually I just try to find something that just gets me in the zone, kind of thing. I have it on. Even with podcasts, I really don't paint with podcasts because I'm trying to do one thing and I can't do two things. So it really is just sort of background noise.
I love the vessel series. Could you talk a bit more about the whole, taking the symbol of women as vessels? You're kind of taking it almost to its natural conclusion, of literally portraying a woman as a vessel. Could you talk a bit more about that?
How I came to it is I was working on that pattern and decorative pieces before this. And so I was thinking about like circles and shapes. And from there, I evolved to more identifiable shapes like baubles, or I transitioned actually very quickly to vessels because I was working on different patterns from different cultures, and I was putting them within the vessel, those patterns within vessels that were related to those cultures. So it was a 2D play, 2D on 2D. And from there, it just very quickly gravitated to, how can I make this more interesting? And also, I was trying to add more content to my work. So it wasn't just a pattern and decorative piece. So there was this layer of what is the history of this pattern? What is the history of this ceramic shape? But then on top of it, I was combining that with, I want to put more in. I want to make these richer pieces that have this layered history where you can really sort of walk away feeling satisfied.
I think you were saying earlier that it seems like the women that whose stories really intrigue you are those who have some mystery to there's some things that are unknown, or maybe some contradictions, like you were saying about Rebecca Rolfe. Are there other examples of someone who intrigued you because of that?
Let me look at my,
Sorry.
I don't have the picture up.
Elizabeth the First is who kind of comes to my mind, and which is, I don't know why she's coming to my mind because she's so well known, but I guess she does have still a lot of like a lot of her internal
The insecurity, yes, the inner life. Yeah, no, I feel like she's a person that we never really get tired of learning about. And there's so many contradictions to her personality, I think, that also intrigue us. And she was so unusual for her time period that I think it's just natural that we gravitate towards it.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, she was somebody, I painted her, and I did that based on the Armada portrait, which was about the English English defeating the Spanish, the naval battle that took place. And there were a number of portraits that were done commemorating that battle. And I found what attracted me about that piece. I mean, she's not somebody I would have normally gravitated to because she's so well known. And I feel like she doesn't really need any more name recognition. But what I did like about her was her political smarts. I mean, she knew that these 3 paintings, I think it was done 3 times, were going to be basically her propaganda outreach, you know, telling people the English are on top now, not the Spanish. And, you know, she was very savvy with how she wanted to be presented. I mean, even though I have read that her teeth were black later in life because she loved sugar and she had, you know, horrible skin. I mean, she always put on the best face, and she knew that that was like job number 1. So I think it's very interesting, you know, when you think about women's history. I mean, Elizabeth is also somebody who, when I hang these women up in my studio, I think, well, who talked to who? Who knows who, you know? There's a little bit of that going on. And Elizabeth and Mary Queen of Scots knew each other. Elizabeth and, let's see, Grace O'Malley knew each other. So there's, and she's not in the show, but there are a number of people that she seems to cross paths with a number of people. And so I find it so interesting, you know, in this day and age when we are like 6 degrees separated from everybody, that this sort of still existed back in that time.
Anita Guys says, I was very surprised that your lady paintings are in black. However, a lot of the ladies were white. Why did you not paint them in their true form?
Well, because I wanted to give them all sort of an equal standing. They're, I didn't want you to see them in terms of race or in terms of age. So there's a universality to them. And they're also timeless. So they're sort of suspended in time, and also you get to see them for who they visually were before you, and then you can read about them and, you know, put the pieces together.
I wondered about the size of the work. I'm thinking in particular about, like you mentioned, the monument to the 2 sisters, and I'm forgetting their names now, but
Edmondson sisters.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking, you know, there's such a lack of monuments dedicated to women, but I feel a monumental sense about your work, and I wonder if that's something that you're conscious of. I wonder if it's just that even though the pieces are small, because there's so many, it feels monumental in that way. I'm curious if that's something that you're thinking of.
Well, definitely. I mean, I think you can't just have one of these in your house. You have to have like 15. It's this conversation between them that is so energized. like I said before, there's the whole like who knows who that's kind of going on, at least in my head. And you know, what would they say to each other? And would Margaret Brent actually like Nur Jahan? Would they get along? You know, that kind of thing that sort of entertains you. But then there's sort of this also this sense of like, look at all these women and they have incomplete histories. You know, we don't know what they look like. We don't know what their signatures were. You know, that the sort of the sense of like there's so much unknown out there, I think is also interesting.
Maremi, thank you so much. It's really been fascinating.
Well, thank you. Yeah, you guys had some really good questions.
Oh, good. Yeah, I mean, from a technical level, from a historic level, like all of it's super fascinating. And so I want to encourage folks again to come out and see the work if you feel comfortable doing so. Just a couple more weeks left of the exhibition. And so come out and see it in person. If anyone has any questions that come up, get those our way and we'll see if we can get them to Maremi as well. I think there's just some really interesting things that we could continue to talk about. Thank you so much again, Maremi. Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you so much. Take care.
So great.
If you enjoy our programs, exhibitions, classes, and workshops, consider supporting us by becoming a member. Members get a lot of great benefits, including discounts on classes and workshops. And you can find more information on our website. And while you're on our channel, check out our other videos and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to get notified about other videos from the Delaplane. Thanks again for watching.